now we're going to look at PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is very often encompassed with anxiety disorders, generally speaking, but it is definitely a unique disorder. It has specific brain changes that can be observed in individuals who have PTSD. And it's really important to acknowledge that as we move into it. I have a link at the very beginning of your outline notes that I would like you to watch before we even begin the notes. It's about 11 minutes long, so I'm not going to incorporate it, have, sit here while it's running. You can do that, but it's important, and I really would like you to watch it. So that would be this link up here. And before I do that, just as a little reminder that this particular disorder was first recognized by the DSM, not 5, not 4, but 3 in 1980. And again, it is biologically distinct from other types of traumatic and non-traumatic stress responses. So please take a few minutes, watch this, and after you're done, click back on me and we'll move through your notes. Okay, hopefully you've done that, and we can move on and look at some of the specific changes that are observed and can be seen in individuals who have been diagnosed. Hopefully you've got a good idea from what we've already looked at in that video of a couple of them. But first, noradrenergic axis changes. In other words, norepinephrine is definitely involved. And if you remember, if you go back to your to those diagrams of the neurotransmitter systems, remember that the neuronal cell bodies for your norepinephrine, noradrenaline, are located in the dorsal pons of the locus coeruleus. And these particular neurons play a crucial role in activating those central and peripheral responses to threat. So it's very essential that we have this system working correctly. And this system, this noradrenergic axis, has broad connections with the cortex, with the hippocampus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala. That should not come as a surprise. Remember the amygdala being that fear, anxiety structure of the limbic system. Hypothalamus and hippocampus are both considered to be part of the system of limbic structures. And then, of course, the cortex for being able to interpret information that's coming in. And finally, the spinal cord. Because without that spinal cord, we're not going to have responses to the threat, to the messages that are coming from your brain, going centrally and peripherally, and then feeding back. This axis organizes affective, cognitive, and motor responses to acute threats. So that's important to remember as we move through. Now, activation of this locus coeruleus is actually the whole axis leads to the secretion of norepinephrine when it's activated. And this induces, hopefully in appropriate ways, behavioral responses to deal with the threats in the environment. And this is one place where we can think about the other anxiety disorders, that they should be appropriate. There should be technically a real threat in the environment. And this is where sometimes things go awry. It has been found that repeated exposure to stressful stimuli actually increases norepinephrine secretion. Then there is a sensitization to stressors, and this is heightened behavioral stress sensitization. So now you have increase in your behavioral response to future exposure of that same stimulus. Ultimately, this can lead to actual depletion of norepinephrine. Remember, norepinephrine, noradrenergic, referring to the same system, release of norepinephrine, which is sometimes called noradrenaline. And this depletion of norepinephrine will lead to decreased exploration, decreased appetite, and deficits in previously well-learned tasks. We can see this readily in experimental animal research. Eventually, this leads to something known as learned helplessness. Pretty sure you've heard about that in your probably intro psych classes and then abnormal psych classes, I hope. But if not, here we are, and this is why it happens, okay? The depletion of norepinephrine. Finally, it's like, I can't deal with this anymore. I can't help myself. I can't even try to come up with a solution or an escape route, okay? So what are some of the clinical findings in PTSD patients? First, we can look at urine output and see an increased amount of norepinephrine and epinephrine metabolites in that urine. And together with that, though, we see a decrease in norepinephrine binding receptors in platelet cells. Now, this is all peripheral, right? So, and then we also see increased autonomic responsivity to trauma-related stimuli, which should make sense. And I mentioned a minute ago about the behavioral sensitization, but we also see this sensitization with the actual norepinephrine. Now, HPA axis changes, you got to know that's coming, right? By now, this hopefully makes sense to you. And what are we looking at? The HPA axis patterns in PTSD. There are changes, but guess what? They are different than those of chronically non-traumatic stressed individuals. We have lower 24-hour urinary cortisol levels. Now remember, this is, you can collect urine for 24 hours, and this is done, I mean, some of us who have experienced issues with, let's say, adrenal shutdown, adrenal fatigue, or some other problem have had to go through this. It's great. You have a jug, and you have to use it every time you urinate and collect that, and then walk around to their jog and take it to the lab after 24 hours. And they will look to see how much cortisol is in there. Now, lots of times what will be happening too is you will maybe have a medication given to you that should decrease your cortisol. That's a different type of test, but anyway, in this case, we don't see high cortisol in the urine of PTSD victims as we might in other people who have been clinically diagnosed with some kind of disorder leading to chronic activation or, you know, lack of a negative feedback loop. And there are some conflicting findings, My guess is that there are differences in the mechanisms and perhaps even how far you are along in the actual development of the disorder of PTSD. There can be differences. So the principal thing I want you to take away from with this is that whereas in other types of disorders, including clinical depression, many patients have elevated cortisol, glucocorticoid levels. In this case, they're lower. In some cases, very, very low. There are also another explanation for some of the contradictions could be the differences in diurnal cycles. Now, and with individuals with PTSD, there can be changes in that cycle. And perhaps these wider diurnal fluctuations can be revealed in some of the testing. Individuals also have shown increased glucocorticoid receptors on lymphocyte cell membranes. Here's another case in which we have evidence for that interaction of the sympathetic nervous system and HPA axis neuroendocrine system and the immune system connecting together and communicating. Together, these different ideas, these data, basically indicate that basal cortisol secretion is definitely altered in individuals who have PTSD. Now, going back to that idea of taking exogenous glucocorticoids, dexamethasone, which your body recognizes as your own glucocorticoids. And if you're given dexamethasone suppression test, you should, if you have the appropriate negative feedback system intact, reduce your own release of corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and ACTH from your pituitary gland. And so then you should start bringing down the cortisol levels. In some individuals, as a reminder, this doesn't happen. This is kind of referring back to these HPA axis changes I just talked about a moment ago. You don't see the same thing. You actually have a more robust suppression of ACTH and cortisol compared to normals or typicals. And this again, and as you might, you might be getting now, is this is important. This is an important point of the neurobiology underlying PTSD. That this contrasts with the 50% of clinical depression patients where you have non-suppression. This is the exact opposite. These and other data actually suggest that individuals with PTSD have an HPA axis that has enhanced sensitivity to feedback inhibition rather than lack of sensitivity, lack of feedback inhibition, different. So according to this model, chronic and recurrent stress events lead to an increased secretion of CRH from the hypothalamus. Sensitivity of the pituitary gland decreases to compensate for this increase of CRH. And then the HPA axis becomes increasingly sensitized. And there is upregulation of glucocorticoid receptors. This is among a gazillion other mechanisms that are or could be playing a role, but this is one thing that's important for us to recognize. It is thought that perhaps tight control of cortisol secretion and the body's and brain's aggressive responses to these acute rises in cortisol may serve to buffer the brain structures from that cellular toxicity. Remember back when we were talking about this, and we talk about this in biopsychostress too. This is a very critical aspect of this whole stress response and its effect on brain structures is that excess cortisol, excess glucocorticoids can damage brain structures that have receptors for those glucocorticoids. One of those, remember, is the hippocampus. So what are some of the neuroanatomical changes that we see in the hippocampus? Now, I want to, this is one reason I wanted you to watch that video at the outset, because there is conflicting evidence, let's say, or conflicting data. As you saw in that video, it was shown in some studies that twins were examined, and twins who had smaller hippocampi to start with and were followed, and one twin did not go to war, did not experience warfare, being in the military, and the other one did. Now, according to some of these studies, the hippocampi were smaller to start with. But one thing that was determined was those individuals who had the smaller hippocampi tended to be more susceptible to PTSD. So this particular note here that I found from some other studies showed a reduction in the right hippocampus volume in one study of Vietnam combat veterans, and another study showed a 20% reduction in hippocampal size in veterans with PTSD. Now, total hippocampal size was negatively correlated with combat exposure and the number of PTSD symptoms. In other words, the smaller the hippocampus, the more it was associated with combat exposure and the number of symptoms. Now, again, if we don't know what the size of the hippocampus was going into combat, prior to combat experiences, we don't know for sure how much reduction in actuality there was. It may be that these individuals start out with a smaller hippocampus, and in this case, it's interesting because in these studies, they found it was specific to the right hippocampus. And then they may have been more sensitive and reduced their volume even more. That is not something that could not happen. So that is another possibility. So similar changes have been found though in the brains of victims of childhood abuse, particularly female survivors of childhood sexual abuse. If you're going to take neurobiology of childhood mental disorders, you will see where we talk a lot more about this and some of the other changes. If we look at this, we have to start going, okay, were some of these individuals starting with smaller hippocampal volumes? Or did all of the reduction that occurred in these victims of childhood abuse occur during and because of that abuse. Questions. Always should be thinking about things like that. So what are the problems, a couple of the problems, and there's always problems, with the data and the interpretation of the data that we have? Most studies have been cross-sectional and have included PTSD subjects who suffer from other comorbid disorders. And once you have these comorbid disorders, which, I mean, it's almost predictable that that's going to happen, there are influences that cannot be accounted for sometimes. And these influences can contribute to some of the findings in patients who have PTSD. And it's very difficult to assess whether these biological findings are from a comorbid condition, as I just said, or are actually premorbid. And I have that in a different order here. Are they premorbid or comorbid, are an actual result from PTSD, which actually is encompassed in that first statement that I made a moment ago. So difficulty teasing out the differences, but one that's pretty standardized, you should be able to acknowledge, is the finding about lower cortisol, basal cortisol, lower norepinephrine levels, leading to learned helplessness. Also, as that video at the beginning, please watch it if you didn't, demonstrated, that not so much in that particular study was the hippocampus the thing that was affected, but the cingulate gyrus. And that is important. That's very important, being the connections that loop around into cortex and down into the more limbic structures, including norepinephrine. So please go back, take a look at that if you haven't already, and pay attention to that cingulate gyrus and the changes there. I'm going to, if this were face-to-face, I would be doing these videos, showing 3 of these videos that I have links for in class. And yeah, you would be seeing me cry. And it doesn't matter how many times I watch a couple of them. And I'm like, I'm desensitizing myself. This is not going to faze me. And it does. That's who you get. In this case, I'm not going to sit here while you watch some of these. You're going to be doing this on your own, so I'm kind of safe. But please, at least the first couple, and then watch the dog helps vet as he becomes anxious. These touch my heart. As most of you have figured out by now, see, I can't even talk about this without starting to cry. This is ridiculous. Dogs, as therapy animals, as connecting with human beings, if you will, can play such important roles. And not all dogs, not every dog may be able to do this, but my goodness, the magic that can happen between an individual and a dog can, you know, it goes beyond sometimes the wildest expectations we might have. And we can see the therapeutic efficacy in using animals like this to help. And so I'm going to leave you with the assignment right now of watching these links, and at least the first 4 if you can, and go on from there. And hopefully, despite the fact that there's a lot of contradiction in some of the findings, know that there is a difference in brain responsivity in the levels of these hormones I've mentioned in individuals with PTSD that contrast with individuals with general anxiety disorder and individuals with clinical depression or both. Okay, so looking forward to the next lecture and talk to you again soon. Come on, computer. Thank you.